Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a critical development that is shaking the strategic balance in Eastern Europe and posing serious challenges to Vladimir Putin's government in Moscow. Russia's lifeline to Crimea has been cut, and the Kremlin is now scrambling to deal with a crisis that strikes at the very heart of its military, political, and symbolic control over the region. Ever since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the peninsula has been both a symbol of national pride and a key military stronghold. For Putin, the move cemented his image as the leader who restored lost Russian territory and reasserted the nation's power on the global stage. But maintaining control over Crimea has always depended on one crucial factor: supply lines. Without a steady flow of troops, weapons, fuel, and goods, Crimea cannot function as a secure Russian fortress. Over the past year, Ukraine has systematically targeted these supply routes, particularly the Kerch Bridge, which connects mainland Russia to Crimea across the Kerch Strait. The bridge, which Putin personally inaugurated in 2018, was both a practical link and a symbol of permanence. It represented Russia's physical and psychological hold over the peninsula, but multiple attacks have damaged and disrupted its operations, leaving Moscow struggling to maintain consistent transport of materials and military hardware. Recent satellite images and intelligence reports reveal that Russia has dramatically reduced the movement of military supplies over the bridge. Freight trains and convoys that once carried ammunition, fuel, and equipment are now few and far between. This is a huge blow to the Russian military, as Crimea's defenses and logistics heavily depend on that link. With the bridge increasingly vulnerable to missile and drone strikes, Russia has been forced to rely on longer, slower, and riskier supply routes through occupied territories in southern Ukraine. The loss of this lifeline is not just a military inconvenience, it's a strategic nightmare. Every additional kilometer of land route increases the time and resources needed to keep troops in Crimea equipped. Every delay makes the front lines weaker. Russian forces stationed on the peninsula are now under mounting strain, facing shortages and delays that chip away at their effectiveness. Even minor shortages can create cascading problems, affecting morale, readiness, and overall operational strength. What makes this even worse for Moscow is that Crimea isn't just another region. It's the crown jewel of Putin's foreign policy legacy. The bridge that connects it to Russia was supposed to be a monument to his power, a symbol of how the Russian state could overcome isolation and sanctions to secure its ambitions. Now, with that very bridge under threat, the image of stability that Putin spent years cultivating is cracking. Inside Russia, the situation is breeding quiet panic. Moscow is officially downplaying the issue, claiming that everything is under control. But behind the scenes, the government is in damage control mode. The Kremlin knows that any perception of weakness in Crimea could have far-reaching consequences. If the Russian public begins to see Crimea not as a triumph, but as a burden, an expensive and vulnerable territory, then the propaganda narrative that has supported Putin's rule for over 2 decades begins to crumble. Economically, the strain is also becoming evident. Russia's war effort has already consumed enormous resources. Sanctions have isolated the economy, inflation continues to rise, and the cost of maintaining the military in occupied regions grows each month. The need to rebuild and defend the Kerch Bridge, while also finding alternative supply routes, adds another layer of expense. Ordinary Russians are feeling the pinch as the costs of living increase and state resources are funneled into sustaining the war effort. Militarily, the consequences are dire. With Crimea's supply lines disrupted, the Russian army must divert attention and manpower to protect what remains of its transport corridors. Convoys moving through occupied territories are frequent targets of Ukrainian drones and artillery. Every successful strike forces Moscow to commit more resources to defense rather than offense, weakening its position elsewhere. The Black Sea Fleet, based in Sevastopol, has also been under relentless attack. The inability to move fuel and supplies efficiently hampers naval operations and exposes more vulnerabilities. Morale within the Russian military is reported to be falling. Soldiers on the front lines are aware of the shortages and the delays. For those stationed in Crimea, the uncertainty of supply lines adds a constant layer of anxiety. The sense that Moscow might not be able to protect or support them fully creates cracks in discipline and motivation. Desertions, low morale, and growing frustration are quietly spreading, despite the regime's attempts to hide the extent of the problem. Politically, Putin is facing one of the most precarious moments of his rule. The narrative that he built of a strong, unshakable Russia capable of withstanding Western pressure is losing its force. Within the Kremlin, there are growing concerns about how long the government can keep the illusion of stability alive. Elites and regional power brokers, once unquestioningly loyal, are beginning to question the direction of the war and the immense cost it imposes on Russia's future. The situation also exposes the weakness of Russia's logistics and infrastructure planning. The bridge, hailed as an engineering masterpiece, was never built with the expectation of sustained warfare. Its vulnerability was underestimated. The explosions and attacks that have struck it revealed both structural weaknesses and the failure of Russia's air defense systems to protect critical assets. Each new strike is not just a tactical victory for Ukraine, it's a psychological blow to Moscow. From Ukraine's perspective, targeting the bridge and the supply corridors is one of the smartest strategic moves possible. By cutting off Crimea, Kiev doesn't need to launch a massive ground invasion. It simply has to starve the Russian forces of resources. This strategy is slow but effective. Over time, the combination of logistical exhaustion, economic pressure, and morale decline can force Russia into retreat or negotiation. Internationally, these developments have not gone unnoticed. Western nations see the disruption of Crimea's supply lines as a potential turning point in the war. If Crimea becomes unsustainable for Moscow to hold, it could shift the balance of power significantly. For NATO and the European Union, this moment underscores how crucial logistics and infrastructure are in modern warfare. It's not just about tanks and troops. It's about supply, energy, and communication. Moscow, meanwhile, is in a frantic search for alternatives. Some reports suggest that Russia is trying to build new land routes through occupied areas in southern Ukraine. But these routes are highly vulnerable. Others mention an increased reliance on ferry transport. But ferries can't move the volume of goods and military equipment needed to sustain the peninsula. The reality is that no replacement can match the efficiency of the Kerch Bridge. As these pressures mount, the situation in Moscow grows more desperate. Behind closed doors, officials are debating how to respond. Should Russia escalate its attacks to distract from the crisis? Should it attempt new peace negotiations to buy time? Or should it double down and commit even more resources to Crimea, despite the risk of draining the rest of the economy? None of these options are good, and all carry risks for Putin personally. In a broader sense, what's happening now reveals the fragility of authoritarian systems built on centralized control and propaganda. When everything depends on the image of strength, even a single point of failure, like the bridge, can create shockwaves through the entire structure. The Kremlin has spent years controlling narratives, suppressing dissent, and presenting an image of confidence. But no amount of censorship can fully hide the cracks that are now appearing. For ordinary Russians, the reality is starting to seep through. The cost of war is visible in the economy, the loss of soldiers, and the scarcity of consumer goods. As discontent grows, the government increases repression, trying to keep society in line. But repression has limits, especially when the underlying problems are structural. If the Crimea issue spirals further, the internal pressure on Putin's leadership could become impossible to contain. Ukraine, on the other hand, has every incentive to keep up the pressure. Each strike that isolates Crimea further tightens the noose around Russia's war effort. Western allies continue to provide intelligence, long-range missiles, and logistical support, allowing Ukraine to target with precision. The war has turned into a test of endurance, and cutting Russia's lifeline to Crimea gives Kiev a powerful advantage in that test. As Moscow struggles to adapt, we're seeing a glimpse of a broader geopolitical shift. Russia's influence, once projected confidently across Eastern Europe and the Middle East, is now being challenged. The loss of prestige and control in Crimea weakens its bargaining power globally. Even allies like China and Iran are watching closely, reassessing how reliable Russia truly is as a partner. In the end, the crisis over Crimea's supply lines is not just a story about a bridge or a war zone. It's about the unraveling of an entire strategy built on illusion and force. When the flow of goods stops, when troops go hungry, and when the symbol of power becomes a target, the narrative of dominance collapses. Putin's lifeline to Crimea is more than a logistics route. It's a lifeline to his political survival. As we look ahead, the question is whether Moscow can adapt fast enough to avoid deeper collapse. Can it rebuild the bridge, secure alternative routes, and maintain control without losing legitimacy? Or will the pressure prove too great, leading to fractures within the regime and perhaps, over time, a change in Russia's direction altogether? Whatever happens next, one thing is clear. The loss of that lifeline has exposed deep weaknesses in the Kremlin's system. The full crisis mode we're witnessing in Moscow is not just about external threats. It's about the internal unraveling of a regime that has built its power on control, fear, and image. The coming months will show whether Putin can survive this test, or whether this moment marks the beginning of a much larger transformation. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you found this analysis insightful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth updates on global events. Stay informed, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.